The do-it-yourself Ruger Mark III Performance Upgrade Kits contain replacement parts for the pistol's factory trigger and hammer and replacement Coco Polo grip panels. The factory trigger usually needs work before most target shooters will be happy with their pistol. Most Mark III triggers come from the factory with a good deal of take-up or pre-travel, creep, and a heavy trigger pull between 4 and 5 pounds. To fix the trigger, we'll install Valcorson's custom trigger parts from the upgrade kit. The kit includes target trigger, trigger plunger, rebound spring, target hammer, sear spring, bolt release, and an Allen wrench. Before beginning disassembly, verify that the chamber is empty and remove the magazine and check that it's empty. Keep the empty magazine handy. The Ruger's disconnector will prevent some operation that's necessary during disassembly and reassembly unless the magazine is installed. To get started, first remove the original grips. Even though we're going to install replacement grips later, if the original grips are left in place, they're certain to get damaged. Next, there are a couple of areas where a little patience and some thinking ahead can save a lot of time. The Valcorson trigger is packaged in a plastic bag with 2 uninstalled set screws. One screw is for the trigger pre-travel adjustment, the other for over-travel. But neither of these parts, installation or adjustment, are addressed within the instructions. If you do not install both before the trigger is installed, you will more than likely have to disassemble the gun a second time to install them. The top screw, the pre-travel adjustment, should be installed Allen head down and started from the top side of the trigger. Because of the trigger's contour, there are some partial threads on the trigger face side. If you attempt to install the screw from this direction, there is a good chance the threads will be damaged. The best bet is to run the screw down into the trigger until it is below the top surface. This way, the adjustment screw will have no influence on the trigger pull until the gun is back together and final adjustments are made. A small drop of medium-strength thread locker will keep it as set, but allow future adjustment. The over-travel screw, Allen head to the trigger face, can be screwed in until flush with the trigger face. This will save time having to adjust it a quarter of a turn at a time until the gun is reassembled. Now turn to the gun. With the Mark III empty and magazine out, remove the mainspring housing. The mainspring housing latch folds in and out like a pocket knife blade with a recess in the mainspring housing. With the housing unlatched, rotate it rearward and out. If your gun is new, the bolt stop pin that projects from the top of the gun's receiver may be gently tapped to free it from the gun. Next, reinstall the empty magazine so that the trigger can be actuated. Tip the Ruger muzzle up, depress the trigger, and pull the bolt out. Remove the magazine. With the bolt removed, use a soft plastic mallet and tap the back of the receiver. This will disengage it from the tapered lug in the frame and allow it to be removed. The Mark III is now field stripped. Before going forward, it's a good technique to use your cell phone camera or small digital camera to document how parts fit together before you take them apart. Next, drift out or press the hammer pin from right to left. As soon as the hammer pin is removed, the bolt release will be free. By reaching and rotating the hammer upward, it will come out as an assembly with the magazine disconnector and disconnector spring. Hold the halves together as they are located on the slip fit bushing that connects them. After this, the safety can be removed. Be careful when lifting the safety from the frame because the ball detent is not secured in the safety other than by light friction and gravity. Raise the disconnector assembly and remove the trigger plunger and its spring. The next components to remove are the sear pin, sear, and sear spring. The pin is removed from right to left. Keep the parts in place until the frame can be lifted to a vertical position for parts removal. The top leg of the spring is orientated to the right of the sear pin when installed. The Valcorson instructions that are included highlights this point, probably because folks install them backwards and upside down. The trigger is held in place with a pivot pin. Because the pivot is free to rotate, it needs to be anchored laterally with a wire spring retainer that rides in the groove that is cut into the pivot pin. Raise the disconnector out of the way and push the retainer down and away from the pivot pin out of the pin groove. Use a narrow punch to push the retainer down and another punch to start the pivot pin out. Remove the pivot pin left to right and lift out the trigger and disconnector. To recap how these pieces are removed, take out the pivot pin, lift out the bolt stop, remove the bolt stop plunger and plunger spring, and lift out the trigger and disconnector. A couple of things will help with the assembly. First, use a punch to align your parts as a sleigh pin from one side, then push out the sleigh pin with the actual pin you're going to use. Second, using a vise to hold your frame will help keep things steady. For reassembly, the new Valquartz sear is the first part reassembled into the frame. The easiest approach is to partially install a punch as a sleigh pin right to left into the frame, then slip the sear spring over it using a pair of needle nose pliers to insert the spring. Then push the sear pin from the left side. The short leg should be wound to the left side of the sear pivot pin, and the long leg should be forward of the frame cross pin. For a functional check, the sear should rotate forward to rotate and tension the spring. Next, the disconnector assembly is engaged in the top hole of the trigger and both are started in place. The trigger pivot pin is installed approximately 2/3 of the way, leaving room to install the bolt stop and bolt stop plunger before the trigger pivot is fully installed. If the pivot pin is hard to start, you may have to depress the trigger retainer to move it out of the way. Install the bolt stop plunger and spring assembly in the frame. The notch goes toward the left side of the frame to leave room for the bolt stop that will be installed next. The stud on the bolt stop drops into the long slotted frame opening. The assembly is rotated down into the notch on the bolt stop plunger until the hole in the bolt stop aligns with the trigger pivot pin. Then the trigger pivot pin is pushed through into the left side of the frame until the trigger retainer clicks into place in the pivot pin. The hammer pivot pin holds several assemblies in place on the frame, including the bolt release, safety, hammer, and disconnect assemblies. Make sure the safety detent on the safety is in its place, then you can install the safety. Lay the safety in place in the frame and pull the sear forward until it engages the notch in the safety. While still holding the safety in place, put the bolt release on the frame, slipped under the bolt stop stud. Insert the hammer pivot pin through the release, through the frame, and barely through the safety. This should hold all of these pieces in place under loading from the sear spring. Raise the disconnector assembly and install the trigger plunger and spring in the recess at the top of the trigger. Assemble the hammer and disconnector pieces. Insert the back side of the bushing into the square opening of the disconnector. Pull out the hammer pivot pin just enough to make room for the hammer without removing support for the safety. Then rotate the hammer assembly slightly forward as it is lowered between the safety and the right side of the frame. When the hole in the hammer is lined up with the hammer pivot pin, press the pin in the rest of the way. The pin is retained laterally by the left grip panel. If the hammer is correctly installed, the long flat of the hammer will be parallel to the top of the gun's frame. A clearance notch will be on the right side. The detent spring will rest between the sear and the detent arm. The hammer strut will rest between the frame's cross pin. To check if these parts are installed correctly, install an empty magazine and pull the trigger while pushing on the back of the hammer. The hammer should rotate forward. Remove the mag and go on to the rest of the assembly. To reassemble the rest of the pistol, refer to your Ruger manual for more details. A few things to note. If you have a tight new gun, when reinstalling the receiver, it may be necessary to lightly tap the back of the grip frame just below the receiver with a soft plastic hammer until it protrudes slightly past the grip frame. It is possible to go too far aft and cause a misalignment that will interfere with the bolt stop pin. It may be useful to tap a little and fit check until the pin passes through cleanly. The hammer strut should drop into the oval recess on the front side of the mainspring housing, and the housing should latch with a small amount of spring resistance. If there is a lot of resistance, something is wrong and the problem should be identified before proceeding. Now it's time to perform your safety checks. First, make sure your pistol and magazine are unloaded. Remember to keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. Pull back the bolt to cock the hammer and let the bolt close. Then insert your unloaded magazine and with the safety on, pull the trigger. The hammer shouldn't fall. Turn the safety off, squeeze the trigger, and the hammer should fall. Remove your magazine, cycle the bolt again, and with the safety off, squeeze the trigger. The hammer should not fall. Then reinsert the magazine, squeeze the trigger, and the hammer should fall. With the gun reassembled and checked out, you may need to adjust the Valquartz trigger pre-travel. A good setting is about 75 thousandths of an inch. Set it by gradually turning the adjustment screw in until there is no pre-travel. then back off until the difference between the gauge reads 75 thousandths. Adjust over travel to the same dimension, 75 thousandths inch past hammer fall. Recheck for function and safety problems. If you have any questions about using or installing any of these products featured in this video, please feel free to contact our tech department via email or on the telephone. We're here to help you out. As always, all the products we sell are backed by Brownells' 100% unconditional lifetime satisfaction guarantee.